Starlink speeds of over 100 megabytes per second in 15 countries already. Starlink is a global satellite system being deployed by SpaceX to provide high-speed satellite broadband internet access in places where it has been unreliable, expensive or completely unavailable. SpaceX Satellite Research, Development and Manufacturing Division is based in Redmond, Washington. Development began in 2015 with the test prototypes of TIN successfully launched on February 22, 2018. By 2017, SpaceX had submitted regulatory documents to launch a total of nearly 1,200 Earth orbit satellites in the mid of 2020s. In May 2019, the first group of 60 prototype satellites was launched. In 2020, SpaceX began providing commercial internet access services in the northern United States and Canada. As of January 2022, the number of Starlink beta test users reached 145,000 in 25 countries. In connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was decided to provide Ukraine with the satellite access to internet. On March 1st, the first batch of Starlink terminals was delivered to Ukraine. The total investment for the project is estimated at $10 billion. SpaceX also plans to sell satellites using the same system for research and scientific purposes. Ookla, which owns the renewed network speed measurement tool Speedtest, analyzed performance data from Starlink and a number of other operators and shares its results. US. Within the United States, Starlink is the fastest satellite provider, and its speeds have only been increasing recently. The Starlink's average download speed increased from 87 megabytes per second in the third quarter of 2021 to 105 megabytes per second in the fourth quarter. As we can see, over the past year, Starlink, using only low Earth orbit satellites, has again become the only satellite internet provider with an average latency of 40 milliseconds, approaching the fixed broadband latency of 14 milliseconds. Other satellite providers, SES, VSAT, and QSNet, currently using higher geosynchronous orbit satellites, had much higher average latencies. However, Starlink performance still varies widely at the country level. In the fourth quarter of 2021, there was a performance differences across regions of the United States. For example, the fastest speeds were 191 megabytes per second in Miami, Florida, and the slowest speeds were 65 megabytes per second in Columbia, Oregon. However, the lowest speeds were well above the FCC's baseline performance level for broadband access, which must be at least 25 megabytes per second. Satellite internet performance outside the US. The company compared satellite internet performance to local fixed broadband in a number of countries. Satellite performance analysis was added this quarter in Austria, Ireland, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Poland, and Portugal. Here's the data of these countries, as well as the countries where the Starlink internet worked before. Australia. Starlink almost tripled its average download rate compared to the fixed broadband. Starlink showed a very good download result of 142 megabytes per second. The average download speed of all fixed broadband providers was 51 megabytes per second. Starlink's average upload speed was 15 megabytes per second, and this is lower than the fixed broadband providers, 18 megabytes per second. Therefore, we can say that the Starlink is a clear alternative to traditional fixed broadband in terms of speed, but Starlink cannot yet compete in terms of signal latency and shows 43 milliseconds against 10 milliseconds for fixed broadband networks. Austria. Starlink's download speeds are more than twice as fast as the fixed broadband, 132 megabytes per second versus 50 megabytes per second for fixed broadband, but Starlink lagged behind fixed broadband by 52 milliseconds versus 13 millisecond latency. Belgium. Starlink is much faster than fixed broadband, 155 megabytes per second versus 77 megabytes per second. In terms of upload, Starlink was only slightly slower, 15 megabytes per second versus 18 megabytes per second. However, Starlink had a higher latency of 45 milliseconds, which is significantly higher than the fixed network's latency of 13 milliseconds. So for rural Belgium, Starlink is a good option. Brazil. Since Starlink is just entering the Brazilian market, we will keep a close eye on the numbers. Here are just figures of the current ViaSat satellite device, which lags even further behind the national fixed broadband service, which is currently experiencing a boom. Canada. Starlink's performance peaked in the fourth quarter of 2021 in 107 megabytes per second, while the average fixed broadband upload rate was 96 megabytes per second. But Starlink's average upload speeds were lower than fixed broadband access, But Starlink's average upload speed was lower than fixed broadband access, 13 MB per second versus 22 MB per second. Starlink's latency was much higher, 55 milliseconds versus 11 milliseconds. As such, Starlink should be considered as an alternative to fixed broadband, especially for rural users, or those who do not have access to fast fixed broadband over fiber. Chile. Starlink shows high speed but is still much slower than sizzling fast fixed broadband. Chilean providers continue to be the fastest in the world, recording the fastest speeds on the Speed Test Global Index in February 2022. It was interesting to see how Starlink would compete with them. Starlink speed in Chile reached 119 MB per second in the fourth quarter of 2021, well below the average download speed for the fixed broadband providers of 169 MB per second. The fixed broadband was also much faster in terms of latency, 7 milliseconds versus 38 milliseconds for Starlink, and 615 milliseconds for HughesNet satellite internet. France. Starlink download speeds have gradually increased and are still higher than fixed broadband access. Starlink's average download speed in France in the fourth quarter of 2021 was 121 MB per second and easily surpassed the national average for fixed broadband access of 91 MB per second. However, the upload speeds were below the fixed broadband median of 17 MB per second versus 69 MB per second, and Starlink's latency was also worse at 51 milliseconds versus 12 milliseconds. Thus, Starlink remains a good option for rural consumers in France. Germany. Starlink outperforms fixed broadband in terms of download speeds. Starlink's average download speed in Germany was 116 MB per second and well above the average fixed broadband speed of 69 MB per second. But Starlink was slower in terms of download speeds, 15 MB per second versus 22 MB per second. Latency was also worse at 47 milliseconds versus 14 milliseconds. Ireland. Starlink downloads were almost twice as fast as the fixed broadband. Starlink's debut is notable in Ireland, where the fourth quarter of 2021 download speeds were double the fixed broadband average of 124 MB per second versus 66 MB per second. Average upload speeds were nearly identical to fixed broadband, 24 MB per second and 23 MB per second respectively. However, Starlink lags behind in terms of latency, 45 milliseconds versus 11 milliseconds for fixed access. Thus, Starlink is a great option for those who are looking for high speed and can't get access to the fixed broadband. Italy. Starlink dominates fixed broadband. Starlink in Italy is decisively ahead of fixed access at 124 MB per second versus 50 MB per second. However, upload speeds were same, 18 MB per second and 18 MB per second respectively. Starlink had higher latency at 52 milliseconds versus 14 milliseconds. That's it, Starlink is an attractive option for the fastest internet in Italy. Mexico. Starlink impressed during its debut of the fourth quarter in 2021. Starlink, which does not become commercially available in Mexico until November 2021, created furor during its debut in the fourth quarter of 2021, achieving an average download speed of 142 MB per second. This was significantly faster than the VSAT, HughesNet, and all fixed broadband providers at 37 MB per second. Starlink also outperformed fixed broadband in terms of upload speed, 22 MB per second versus 9.5 MB per second. However, signal latency was worse at 64 MB versus 11 milliseconds. Holland. Starlink is faster for average download but lags behind in uploads and latency. The Netherlands, first on the list, has some of the highest median mobile and fixed broadband speeds in the world. As such, we couldn't wait to see how Starlink would perform against its competitors. In the fourth quarter of 2021, Starlink achieved average download speeds of 135 MB per second compared to 96 MB per second for fixed broadband. Starlink, however, lagged noticeably behind in upload speeds at 60 MB per second versus 31 MB per second. Starlink also had a higher latency of 45 milliseconds versus 11 milliseconds. New Zealand. Starlink was slightly slower but still faster than the fixed broadband downloads. Starlink's average download speed in the fourth quarter of 2021 was 116 MB per second, which was faster than the average fixed broadband speed of 99 MB per second. However, Starlink was much slower on uplink at 14 MB per second compared to fixed broadband's 59 MB per second, which was up significantly in the fourth quarter compared to the third quarter, which was at 24 MB per second. Starlink's average latency in the fourth quarter of 2021 was 79 milliseconds, much worse than 6 millisecond latency of fixed broadband networks. Poland. Starlink in Poland became operational in September 2021 and it's already showing high speeds. Starlink's average download speed were much higher than the fixed broadband, 129 MB per second versus 48 MB per second. Upload speed was roughly comparable but slightly slower, 24 MB per second versus 29 MB per second. Starlink's latency was longer, gaining from 58 milliseconds versus 10 milliseconds. This is still acceptable for online gaming but higher than optimal. Portugal. Starlink is far ahead in the download speeds but loses on its uploads. Portugal was another newcomer this quarter where Starlink beat the fixed networks with a score of 140 MB per second versus 95 MB per second. However, it lost on average upload speeds of 30 MB per second to 66 MB per second. In addition, it had much higher latency of 44 milliseconds versus 7 milliseconds. For the Portuguese, Starlink is a good option if there is no access to good fixed broadband. UK. Starlink's speed is still twice the average fixed broadband speed of 122 MB per second versus 58 MB per second. Average uplink Starlink download speed is 14 MB per second and comparable to fixed broadband networks at 17 MB per second, but latency was worse at 36 milliseconds versus 15 milliseconds to fixed broadband networks, although that is enough for multiplayer online gaming. Starlink has already surpassed its satellite bet on VSAT, HuNet, and the other and is now successfully competing for its terrestrial lines. If we talk about the provider's premium service, it looks like it will put fixed line operator focus on business customers in a difficult position because it will offer speeds in the range of 150 to 500 MB per second and to 20 to 40 millisecond latency for $500 per month.